I'm Michael Alexander, the Director of City Conversations. We're presented by SFU Public Square. We want to thank our sponsors, SFU Vancouver, the Center for Dialogue, and the SFU City Program. If you haven't found a seat yet, please do. We're almost full today. We thought we'd need the big room, and yes, we do. We want to acknowledge first that this event is taking place on unceded traditional Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And this is our most formal of all the formal rooms at SFU Vancouver. But for those of you who have not been to a city conversation before, we do not have speakers and we do not have an audience. Instead, we have presenters, in this case today just one presenter, and we have participants, and all of you are the participants. That's really important. Most of the time, almost all of the time today is going to be for your questions, but particularly your opinions, your observations, your priorities, what you want to see out of Vancouver in the coming years. The point of city conversations is very simply to encourage conversation. If you brought your lunch, thank you very much. It is not rude to eat your lunch at city conversations. We understand this is a lunchtime event, and many people have to get back to work. So let's get started. If you're tweeting, hashtag CityConv. We're passing around sign-up sheets. If you're not on our email list, please put your name and email down so that you can know what's coming up. We're getting an exciting program together for next year, and we have one more event this year. But today, we want you to meet Gil Kelley, and we want him to meet you. Gil is Vancouver's new Director of Planning, Urban Design, and Sustainability. Those words matter. Unlike his immediate predecessor, he is not also the Director of Development. He's not handling permits. He's not handling the small stuff. Gil has been in his new job all of about 6.5 weeks. He's been learning a complex city government, meeting his staff and those of other departments he works with, familiarizing himself with the city's other senior managers and councilors, and the region's issues. He did have one public talk to a full house at the Vancouver Playhouse about 3 weeks ago, and there he voiced an ambitious agenda. He said that since our city's glory days in the mid-1980s and 90s, planning has shrunk, he said. We need to be leaders, not just regulators. He reminded us that the purpose of planning is to answer, where do we want to go? So where did Gil come from? San Francisco most recently, and Portland and Berkeley before that, so he knows the West Coast and has long experience hearing loud voices and demanding voices. We wanted to give him an early opportunity to hear from you. The quieter, more respectful, unfortunately or unfortunately, are sometimes more oblique Canadian voices. So with that, welcome, Gil Kelley.
Thank you, and thank you, Michael and SFU for having me here today. This is a real honor and pleasure for me, so thank you. I'm kind of living the Vancouver life here. I'm living near that little marina there off on the right-hand side in one of those towers, so it's the iconic Vancouver that I've dropped myself into, at least as a lessee. I'm really enjoying getting to know the city. I've obviously visited a number of times before, but I'm really beginning to learn the territory more closely, and I'm enjoying that. And I'm actually hoping, as Michael alluded to, that today is part of my learning experience. In 6 weeks, I wish I could tell you I have all the answers, but I don't. So I'm actually going to want to hear as much from you or more than I'm able to tell you today. And maybe be back in a year when I actually have some answers. But it would be very, very helpful for me to not just hear 100 questions I'm supposed to answer, but because I'll say, well, I don't know yet, but to actually hear your thoughts, particularly about current issues and what your aspirations are for the future of Vancouver. Because Vancouver, like the other West Coast cities that I've been involved in, is really on the cusp of change. And it's a moment, I would say, of inflection in the city's trajectory over time. And it needs a robust planning conversation, both the capacity within the city and a conversation with the entire community to kind of really get our minds around what that future ought to be and how we might start walking down that path to that desired future. So that's kind of what I'm all about, and I'm really anxious to hear from you today. I thought I would. Michael introduced my background sufficiently, so I won't go over that. But I thought I would sort of set out 3 ideas here. And one is simply a reflection of what I think a planning director ought to be and ought to do. And we can talk about, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. To talk about this notion of particularly these West Coast cities that I think are in many ways leading change for the whole globe in terms of finding that sweet spot between livability and prosperity and yet affordability and inclusiveness. And that's not easy to do. And that's the dilemma I think that this city and San Francisco and Portland and Seattle are all facing. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then I just simply wanted to talk about the importance and the power of engagement and how we need to do that perhaps in new ways and not just old ways. So in terms of the planning director, the obvious thing is that I need to listen. Any good planner doesn't just parachute in and tell you what you need to do. I probably wouldn't last more than a few weeks if I tried to do that. It wouldn't be any good anyway. And so the power of listening and deeply questioning and deeply hearing, I think, is the first duty that I have. But beyond that, I think it's also important for me to help you frame the larger questions. Much of the planning activity, I think, has been focused on immediate development projects and permitting and so forth, and shaping those, which is all important work to do. But I think the conversation that maybe has been missing a bit is really what kind of community do we want to be? What are we going to be when we grow up? And who gets to have a say in that? And so I think that sort of framing both questions and opportunities is really important. I will say that as I get my feet on the ground a bit more and do more listening, I think part of my duty is to provoke some ideas about the future and some choices. Of course, I still hang on to a part of the development review function, and that is to say the larger projects and the more discretionary pieces where we actually make judgments about projects, whether it's about affordability, about the height of the building, about its fit with the neighborhood, all that kind of stuff still falls within my purview. And so I think both exercising good judgment about that, but also making my own decisions and those I recommend to City Council with a future lens applied, I think is important. So there may be a little bit of push there, a little bit of friction at times. But I think that's part of my role to do. Another piece is to build the capacity of the organization. Michael mentioned the words I used at the talk I gave at the Urbanarium a few weeks ago, which was just my early perceptions. And one of those is that I think the planning function has shrunk a little bit. And it needs to be, and staff there are very good, but they kind of need to be encouraged. And I think the other city departments need to understand that planning has a very major role in practically everything they do and everything the citizens of the city want the city to become. And so what we do, I think, has implications for all the other city departments, as well as many partners, public and private, throughout the city. And so that's, I think, the final thing I would say is that the planning director ought to be someone who is out there, not sitting in the office making judgments about individual developments, but is actually out in the community both having the future conversations, but also enlisting the partnership of civic groups, of neighborhood groups, of businesses, of the philanthropic sector to sort of really make things happen. And I think you've had that tradition in the past in San Francisco, kind of going back to the Larry Beasley days and Ann McAfee. I think those were important efforts that were made. There's probably a new form of planning now, but I think the notion that they were both bold and they were engaging partners, I think is a very important aspect if you really want a robust planning function here. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to throw out. Michael told me to be brief, and I will because I do want to hear from you. The second thing I mentioned was about this inflection point that I think Vancouver is at right now. And that's hard to notice when you're just here. I mean, when you are here and have been here a long time and everything is just a little incremental change day by day. But I think if we stand back and look at the growth that's coming, the affordability crisis, frankly, that's here now, the immigration, the changes in who we are, the generational shift that's going on now, these are very, very powerful drivers of change. And so if we want to carry forward as the Vancouver we love, we also need to embrace those changes as well in the process. And so that, I think, is not unique to Vancouver, and it certainly was my experience in San Francisco and to some degree in Portland before that. Backing up even a step further, I would say that all cities, first of all, the world's population has just tipped the point in the last few years where it's now majority urban, right? And yet, most of our governmental structures have been set up on the basis of having kind of agrarian economies, right? We're operating off of these 200-year-old models of governance. And it doesn't, that form does not actually acknowledge that cities are the places where everything is happening, where innovation happens, where wealth accumulation happens, where a lot of on-the-ground decisions for society just get made, formally and informally. And so we're in that kind of awkward transition in terms of challenging how we make decisions, both locally and globally. So that's one piece of context. The other thing is I think there are two sort of existential threats, if you will, to cities. One certainly is climate change. And I won't go on and on about that because you all understand that. If I were in Iowa or perhaps even parts of rural Canada, I would have to explain more about climate change. I won't do that here in Vancouver. But it is very real, and its implications for us are not just the thing we always talk about, but the urgency of making that shift. And so being actually aggressive about energy conservation, about a shift away from automobiles onto transit and biking and walking, all those things that we already know about. I guess what I would add to that is just the imperative that we make those shifts sooner than later. But the other existential threat is also global, and that has to do with growing disparities of income, of wealth, of opportunity. And so all of these favorite cities of mine, from Vancouver down to San Francisco, are really deeply starting to question, who are we as a community? Are we losing our soul? Are we becoming simply a boutique city for second homes, for the very wealthy, for the very poor, but the middle, sorry, you're going out to the edges of the region and maybe even having to leave the region. Do we have an economy that supports a middle class any longer? Are housing prices so out of reach, whether those are for ownership or for rental, that those people just can't stay here? And that is, you're feeling a lot of that pressure now in Vancouver. I would just let you know you're in good company. All the other cities I've mentioned are in the very same boat. So that's the second, I think, existential threat, if you will, to urban life. There are lots of others. I mentioned one about governance, but there are larger forces behind that as well, which is the rapid change in technology around communication. So the digital economy and what is called now the Internet of Things is actually a $19 trillion economy. We're just in the beginning edges of that. That will change employment. It will change how we look for houses, how we share things. This sharing economy, sort of represented at the front end by things like Uber, controversial here. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I think our lifestyles will change profoundly with this sharing economy, including sharing homes, sharing vehicles, sharing all kinds of facilities. I think it's going to kind of emerge as something quite different than I'm a resident of X community and I have my house and I go to my job and I have my friends, and I think all of that is going to start getting shifted in good ways probably, but it won't be easy and recognizable at first. And there's a whole constellation of these kind of drivers of change, but I think those are the principal ones. And so part of my job here is to engage you about those changes and what makes sense in terms of a future path here to maintain livability, to maintain affordability, and long-term sustainability, and this sense of being an inclusive city. Those are four powerful attributes that I think we all aspire to. Getting there won't be easy, and it will involve some choices. And so I don't have the answer for you again today, but I do. That's my focus, is to figure out how we get there. I'm very fortunate in my role to have both the city's urban design function, and I believe strongly in the power of design as not only a creative process, but a problem-solving process. And so it's great, and I want to build that function up again. I also have the city's sustainability group, which is also a nice welcome, and that has been brought over and joined into the planning department. I'm getting the hook here, so I'll just add one more thing, which is I do want to talk about how should we effectively engage one another, not just the city posting a notice for a public meeting or a public hearing, but going way beyond that in terms of how do we actually have a community-wide conversation, even if it's not all at once, about these important issues. How do we frame that? What technologies do we use? How do we get into your living rooms or places you meet with friends? I think there's a moment of opportunity also in how we engage one another. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Michael, because I think I'm MC here, moderator.
Great, thank you, Gil. Okay, it's your turn. Not just questions, opinions, priorities, interests, what's on your minds that will affect Gil's job, how he does it, and what direction the city wants to go. I'll take hands up, but I'm going to try to follow themes here. So if somebody addresses a particular point, I'm going to ask, does somebody else have a comment on that point or to that topic, so that we just aren't scattershot all for the remaining time. Here we go. Yes, sir, right in front.
One more comment. Just people ask me all the time, was this move to Vancouver simply an election time sort of diversion for me? And if the election turns out one way, I'll go back, and if it turns out another way, I'm going to stay for sure. I'm staying in either case. I certainly have hopes about the election turnout. I'll keep that to myself, but you might guess. But I am planning to stay, and I love Vancouver. So.
Okay.
Okay, what's your experience with and impression of community land trusts and shared ownership as a means of getting sustainable and affordable housing? I'm talking about the models from all the big cities in Northern Europe and Burlington, Vermont, and the likes thereof.
Yeah, a good provocation. I probably need to learn from you about some of that, particularly about the local situation. I would say that the affordable housing question has been somewhat narrowly defined here in Vancouver, at least, and perhaps Canada in general, around social housing and government-sponsored, government-owned, have had little experience so far in reaching out into the nonprofit world or the co-op world, the co-housing world. There are a lot of models out there, and probably it's going to take all things. I am a fan of the community land trust model. I'll just say that and try to promote that in San Francisco, and even in a robust housing market like San Francisco and a very politically active community, it's really still in its infancy there too. I think for, not only for creation of new housing, but for preservation of housing. Remember, most of the affordable housing is already on the ground, folks. It's not to be built. We have to do something about maintaining the affordability of the large housing stock that we have, much of which is rental. And so I think the community land trust model is actually a very efficient way to have long-term affordability. That's all I'll say there. But we'd love to engage the community here about it. Because, you know, housing, the nuances of housing funding and organization around community housing is probably, affordable housing is a bit different here than my experience. It's one of the things that I've got to learn. I don't know if any of you attended the housing summit, or this part of the housing reset strategy reset that the city is now undergoing. It was a very, very interesting summit of really international leaders and thought about affordable housing here just the last week. And that was referenced, but it was not made into a primary topic. So.
Stay with it. Let's stick with housing. So, yes, sir. Stand up. Yes.
Hi, Kel.
Hello.
I've done a fair bit of work in affordable housing.
Could you get a microphone, please?
I've done some work in affordable housing, predominantly up in Whistler, where we tackled the problem beginning about 20 years ago with some success. And I guess a couple of things occur to me. I've been trying to get the conversation going in Vancouver for a decade without a lot of success. And I have a couple of observations. One is that, especially now, and you use the word urgent, and it is urgent, especially now, the market is not going to solve the problem. Tweaking the market, incenting the market, regulating the market is not going to solve the problem. It's going to nibble at the edges, but we really need a different way. And I think we need to embrace the different way. And community land trusts are one. You mentioned there's a lot of models. We have a model we used in Whistler. There's co-housing, there's co-op housing. We also need rental housing, we need affordable home ownership. So there's lots of different models. I think the delivery vehicle for those models are the nonprofits. So a community land trust is an example of a nonprofit. But the struggle I think the city is having is they're trying to be in partnership with the private sector, the solution. They're trying to drive the solution that way. When really, if we could shift the focus, we don't need to stop that, but we need to open up and shift the focus to the nonprofits.
Thank you for that perspective. From what I've seen, I agree entirely with that. And it's very interesting to note that Whistler, which can be viewed as simply an anomaly because it's a resort community, has actually been a real leader in terms of both the sustainability and the notion of having, you can't sustain that level of tourist industry and engagement in that economy without having workers, right? And if the workers can't live there, the whole place shuts down. And so it's almost a microcosm of what we're talking about when we talk about a larger city like Vancouver. It's like, if we lose all the people who are doing the less than top end salary jobs here, we're not really a real city anymore. And so I agree. I don't think government is, through my office particularly, is trying to leverage the private sector in terms of inclusionary housing and other requirements, and that's all good. It's still not enough. And I think that, you know, I mean, I grew up in a time where affordable housing meant doing a good job of providing options and protections for the lowest income people, and everybody else was kind of, they would make their way and they'd be on their own. I think the reference to the Northern European and Western European model is an acknowledgement that housing is almost a form of infrastructure. It is so basic that everyone needs to participate. And so all of our models that you mentioned are still built on the old think. And so I think it is a major shift in our thought process. And again, without huge federal dollars or national dollars, it's going to be a hard climb for us locally to find those resources. But I think it begins with a shifting mindset around what housing is.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
One more on housing. Yes.
Hi, thanks for coming. So I've recently returned home. I've actually been living in California for the last 7 years, and I just am coming out of a year-long research project on the housing crisis in Santa Cruz. So, and I hear from the last couple of comments in my response just now, thinking about housing, affordable housing, and so maybe I'm going to just reframe this, and there's a question in here, but also a bit of a demand. To think about housing and the needs for affordable housing and different kinds of housing as a part of a bundle. So when we pick up housing, it's not just housing, right? It's related to meaningful employment and health opportunities and food security opportunities and all of these things. So that was something that was coming out of my research in California, but also thinking about our elected officials and leaders such as yourself, and thinking about the kinds of voices you're bringing to the table to discuss these issues. And this has already been mentioned with regard to involving nonprofit organizations. As I'm reacquainting myself in Vancouver, I hear interesting initiatives and programs around sustainability, Green City Action Plan, the Vital Signs Foundations and things like this, but it still really sounds like the voices of the people who are like mostly okay. So there's a question about what are your plans for, and also a real strong desire for me to see ways of bringing the voices of the most marginalized community members to the table in long-term, meaningful ways.
Yeah. What I would say is yes, that is important. That's part of what I alluded to in the beginning. In Portland, when I was planning director there, and we were sort of gearing up to do our sort of biggest picture planning, the sort of redo after 25 years or so of the citywide comprehensive plan, we kind of thought about how we would launch that effort and decided that the most important thing we could do was not propose a thing or a policy, but to actually engage people who were not the typical voices. And so we did a process called Vision PDX is the moniker for the airport, right? And engaged about 22,000 people who were largely immigrants, largely poor, did not attend city meetings, some of whom were not on the internet, and really went to where they were to kind of frame a whole new value statement. And so the planning work from that point forward, and was still going on and still is after I left, really centered around not just sustainability but equity as well, and continuing that dialogue with the community, because in many ways those are the future voices, both the younger generation and, as I alluded to, the new waves of population have to be, even selfishly for people who have everything they need right now in Vancouver, they have a love of Vancouver that they want to have carry on. And so the notion of having a larger conversation that both extends benefits but also educates about those values is really, really important. And so I agree, it's, you know, and again, back to the housing question, it's easy to isolate housing, and you talk about dollars, either income or the price of the unit or the rent structure and funding sources. But even just looking at a slightly larger picture of what affordability is, it includes transportation and childcare and other things that often don't get measured. And so if housing is the only thing, it's going to be cheaper to find housing at the periphery of the community. But if you add transportation costs to that, if you have 2 workers and you have to add childcare to that, it goes up pretty fast, and it's pretty close to what the inner price structure really is, and a burden on families. So that's just one level. When you add employment in, which is kind of the way up and out for a lot of people, that tends to be a segregated conversation, and I think you're absolutely right. We need to kind of merge these. What is the new livability standard and means for people in Vancouver? Thank you.
One more on housing, and then we'll move on to a different topic. Hands, please. Where'd the hands go? Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to Vancouver. My name is Devin Knight and I live in a tower at the end of False Creek. This is a little bit of a tangent from housing, but I was very glad to hear you say you're interested in urban design. I think in our downtown core, I don't understand why, but I think our architecture all looks the same. So many condo buildings with blue glass windows, and I'm just hoping that you'll get us all excited about better architecture. And I wonder if you had some ways of promoting exciting building design in the 2 cities that you've worked in.
Yeah. I think there is a sameness to Vancouver. I think that's a fair argument. There is a sort of iconic quality to the architecture along False Creek, largely done by James Chang, which is actually kind of a remarkable thing in history. But I think it's time also, and I think James himself is aware of this, is to experiment with some new prototypes and some new thinking. I agree. Yet Vancouver has maybe lost a little bit of the sense of it has layers of history here, because it seems to be marked by this fence of 1980s, 1990s architecture that's very, very similar building prototypes and to some extent the same, and perhaps the same on Coal Harbor side. So just speaking about the core city. I would posit that not only is it important to kind of reimagine architecture in the core of the city, but actually to focus on the streets and the street life and our public spaces. And I think that's at least as important, and if not more important. And I think that, oftentimes in community conversations and then through developing community plans and ultimately zoning, we set an acceptable height limit, whether that's 400 feet, 500 feet, 550 feet in the West End now. And you can end up with a real haircut, right, of buildings that are all the same. And so I think part of my job is to sculpt the skyline, respecting the view cones that are sort of sacred, but even within that template of view cones, there's a lot of sculpting that can be done. Different materials that can be used, different building massing and orientation. So I think there's a lot more variety we can introduce in the built form, but again, I would direct you to the ground plane as well, and making that feel like the real public place, because that's increasingly where we spend most of our time. Our housing units are getting smaller, and we're living much more in that social space between the ground floor buildings and the street.
Let's follow along that theme over here. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Gil. That's very, like the last speaker.
Give your name, please.
Frank
Thank you, Devin, for reminding me that I had failed to ask people to identify themselves.
Frank Kelley, former senior urban designer with the city of Vancouver, as a matter of fact. And I was very thrilled to hear you say you're going to rebuild that component of the city in the halcyon 80s and 90s. There were probably 15 or 20 urban designers, qualified people who could partner with relevant applicants and help them guide their way through the system to get a better outcome. So why did the ones who were there leave is a big question. And some of us aged out, possibly others, people in mid-career left for other reasons, were driven out. And I hope to hear and want to hear how you intend to attract those people back to build that component of the city, which is not only about downtown and the skyline, by the way. It's, of course, certainly all over the city. Thank you.
Right. No, great point. And I would actually like to engage, and I'm beginning to engage some of you individually, and I would like to engage more of you as a group and get your wisdom, and whether you literally come back into the city or whether we're educating the next generation of urban designers and planners, and perhaps doing both at the same time, I think is essential, because I think what we see a generation from now is what we build now, and that ought to be really special and really wonderful. I think of Vancouver as an international iconic city, and its architecture and its public spaces ought to reflect that. So, thank you for that statement.
Public spaces, street life, streets. Here, please.
Microphone right here.
Put her mic.
Hi,
Hello.
Mary Jo Federley. I'm with the Persons with Disability Advisory Committee in the City of Vancouver, and I'd like to hear your opinion and also just your reflections on what you see so far about universal design and how the city is coming along with the capacity to really lead the way in that. The city has suggested that they have a mandate that by 2020 they'll be the most accessible city in North America, and they're a long way off. There isn't even a policy statement or a manual right now that exists within the city. There's huge disparities between what people do and what's supposed to be done, and the city planners, the engineers, the bylaws, and there's not a lot of cohesion between our, we work really hard on our committee, like spend over 25 hours a week in meetings and in planning, and we make suggestions and they just go by the wayside.
Well, first of all, I'd like to come to your committee and hear from you directly. I don't think there should, retrofitting existing building stock has its own challenges. I just want to give you a little interesting factoid. And this has been rigorously documented now. The city of Rome, which we often call the Eternal City, that's been around so long and it's still going, has actually been rebuilt 13 times in its history. The only thing that's constant, other than a few relics like the Forum and the Colosseum, is the road pattern. Everything else has been rebuilt. And they've looked at the ancient pathways and up into the 1700s, exactly the same road they had, except for a few big clumsy moves that Mussolini made in broadening some boulevards. The reason I'm saying that is that I think we ought to be thinking about Vancouver's infrastructure being rebuilt, and it should be universal. It should be a universal design. And that, to me, that is a key part of that inclusive city that we ought to have. Just no question about it. So how we accelerate those policies and programs, I'd be very interested to come and talk to your group about it. I think it's absolutely the right. And I don't see it in conflict with other objectives. Sometimes there's a narrow conflict around retrofitting existing buildings because it's an historic structure and so forth. But that's a minority of cases. Let's focus on the big game. So, thank you for that.
Okay, streets, street life.
We're going to take some from the back here, Michael.
Yep.
Yep.
Great. Well, welcome, Gil.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you here. I just wanted to bring forward a point. I think. I'm sorry. My name is Matt Hogue. I'm actually building an Internet of Things business. So for TELUS. But that, I'm not associated with TELUS in this conversation. But
you have a listening device, probably.
I may have more than one. It's the beauty of the Internet of Things. So, Gil, so what I am speaking to you from is being a young professional, seeing the challenges of the affordability crisis, being an environmentalist, realizing that we are in a crisis of the environment and we need to lower our impact. And then what I want to bring forward is, and I'm not looking for answers, looking for understanding of how you're framing conversations and who you're bringing to the conversation. And very much, when I look at Vancouver, it's a city I love. I moved here 16 years ago. But when I look at Vancouver and I look at the number of homes that one could live in the city, relative to the landmass, it's not a great picture, right? So in terms of the census data I looked up a while ago, I think it's about 200 dwellings per square kilometer. And when you do the quick math on that, that's not townhouse density. It's kind of suburban density when you figure it out. And so I guess the question to you is, how would you frame the conversation and who would you bring into that consultation if you were to reimagine how the lowest density parts of our city are and how making some change there could perhaps make things more livable, more affordable, while still, and bring people back into the city?
No, it's a key question that I know I'm going to be facing, and I've already been hearing about that. And I guess I would reframe it a little bit in the sense that I like to get away from binary choices. It's either very dense or it's suburban. There's a fellow in Berkeley now, an architect, who's been writing about the missing middle, and I assume that was the middle income band, which it could correlate to, but it's really the missing middle housing type. And so that in North America, I would include both Canada and the US in that, our planning codes tend to acknowledge the single family home or the single family home plus an accessory suite. And then the sort of larger apartment block all the way up to the tower. And what's kind of missing is the traditional building type that occurred in most North American cities up through the 40s, which was sort of more the courtyard housing of 3 or 4 floors, or duplex, triplex, quadruplex, that actually fit well into many of those neighborhoods you're describing. And if you think about equating even that moderate density over such a large landscape, it's a potentially not only a powerful way to accommodate population, but provides choice for people, right? Some people want to live right near the transit corridor. They can, dash out the front door with their cup of coffee and get on the train. Some people have both the means and the desire to live in a large single-family home. Others don't need that much space, don't have as much economic power to go spend $7 or $8 million on a home, but have enough means to either buy or to rent in this middle band. And that middle band is kind of missing. There are some representations of that in some of the older buildings in the West End, on some of the corridors, but it's kind of the minority of the housing stock. And I think when you think about more shared living and that kind of thing, sharing of services, I think that building prototype needs to kind of come to the fore a little bit. And again, it's not an either or. I think it's that vast middle of it actually is the new frontier for how we live. Getting transit supportive densities out of that is another question. So we have to kind of wrestle with all of that. Does that make sense? Okay.
Anyone here? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Welcome to Vancouver. My name is Nicholas Chernin, born and raised in Vancouver, so coming on to my 5th decade of watching change in the city. So first of all, I have an answer for one of your questions.
Great.
Yeah.
Let me write it down.
In regards to engagement,
yeah.
I would suggest that within your department that you work and demand, in fact, from the marketing department to support you, not just with engagement, but actually true, big, bold invitations to the public to come out to events, public hearings, open houses, those kinds of things. And right now, I think anyone in this room can open up, can think about when they've opened up a local newspaper and it's a 1/8 of a page, boring black and white ad about an open house. And yet the marketing professionals can market a brand new Nike shoe and everyone wants to go and buy it. So if we can apply that kind of marketing technology to stuff that actually impacts our lives in a meaningful way, I would suggest that you do that.
Especially if you can pick it up on your iPhone, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Thank you. Any other answers out there? This is great.
I have someone who's I think has an answer maybe.
Hi, my name's Ian Mass, and it is about engagement. Thank you. I think there's a crisis of confidence, and it's reflected fairly squarely on the planning department, because you're the ones who are out there, and others are more behind the scene. Back in the so-called good days, using your analogy, there was a way that that council and the public got. There was a fairly major piece where city council reports, the directors would write their own reports. They would be incorporated into a report, but the city manager and the politicians had the maturity to see in print disagreements, policy disagreements come to them. And so instead of immediately, it was the politicians who were politicizing the issue, people would come to council and they'd say the director of engineering got what we had to say about this, or the director of social planning. There's no such thing anymore. So, you know, the maturity of the city manager, Fritz Bowers, Ray Spaxman, Dave Rudberg, those kind of folks, they could put those things forward, the public would see themselves reflected in those reports, and it was certainly a more open time. Now, it was 30, 40 years ago. It may not work the same way, but I think it's something to bring back. Thank you.
Very, very interesting, because now there's actually a concurrence process where department heads are supposed to battle for a while, but then ultimately concur on what goes to council, which could be seen as good governance, because a lot of it isn't just, well, throw it up to council. On the other hand, it may suppress some of the active debate that citizens may want to see reflected in their own government.
Yeah, and that's a corporate way of doing
Yeah. Yeah. They even call us the corporate management team when we come together, so there you go.
Somebody in the front here, woman? Yes?
Hi there. So my question is about seismic upgrading. Oh, sorry, my name is Frankie James. I'm a resident of Gastown, and I live in one of the buildings that's been identified as seismically at risk. There are hundreds and hundreds of private buildings which are at risk, and we do not have bylaws to fix that. So there is no great incentive for the building owners to fix that. We need bylaws to encourage building owners to do the right thing. And because you're from California, you'll have lots of experience on how to encourage that. And so I'm interested in seeing what we could do to encourage or have bylaws to get private buildings upgraded. Because it's people who are renting who are most at risk. If you're a building owner, you don't live there, who cares? But it could decimate an area like Gastown if there's an earthquake.
Yeah, a huge issue around the resiliency of the community as a whole, resiliency in terms of people not being displaced, but also resiliency in terms of not losing a whole band of community that are renters because their buildings collapsed or whatever. And over time, that whole population is at threat. So I agree with the issue and the importance of it. What's difficult is that the cost of retrofitting some of these buildings is difficult. And so in California, for example, after 20 or 30 years of putting most emphasis on building codes, which are really primarily about new buildings and major retrofits, the policy has now shifted to focusing on existing building stock. And generally that's done in San Francisco's case, for example, by isolating a particular building prototype. And so in San Francisco's case, it was called the soft story buildings, which are essentially multi-level, multi-story apartment buildings for the most part, rentals that had a ground floor of essentially an apartment. And those are very, very wobbly in an earthquake. And so that was the first category. And so there was a period of close to 10 years, I think, of just educating and seeking voluntary compliance with better buildings. And just in the last year, that is switching over now to a mandatory compliance. And honestly, that's just being sorted out as to what are those costs, what does it mean, is there a sort of life safety standard that's a little bit lower than permanent structural capacity to remain in place after an earthquake versus safety for exiting and so forth. That debate is going on right now in San Francisco. In Berkeley, across the bay early on, I was promoting something similar, but for what we called URM buildings, which is unreinforced masonry, so you just have masonry block buildings with no, and those were also very expensive to do. And we did the same approach, which was educating, incenting with a little bit of money. And over time, we were getting fairly good compliance, I have to say, because not every building owner is the sort of, I don't care, absentee. I mean, some of these, they're not going to sleep at night if their building falls down and people are killed. So I think it's really finding the financial means, and whether that's finding some long-term, low-interest sleeper loan. I mean, nobody's showering money on us, so we've got to be creative on the financial part of that, I think, to resolve it. But it's clearly a huge issue. No question.
I've got someone in the back here, Michael.
One in the back and then down here.
Thanks. I have an answer. My name is Sean Smichael, registered landscape architect. Hire more landscape architects. Cool. But that speaks to the level of engagement that I think the city needs in terms of master planning with communities, but also the public life. Right now, you try to get a job as an urban designer of the city, and you have to be an architect and or a planner, but architect first. And so I think there needs to be an openness to the city in the way that I think matches the professional goal. But our architects and landscape architects and engineers and planners are having a much broader, more diverse discussion than I think many of the cities are in terms of who's engaged in helping make cities more vibrant and more deliberate in terms of how they bring life, to those pieces of infrastructure, which is important, as you said, as we get smaller and smaller housing units and live more and more in those shared spaces.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have a lot of sympathy for that point of view, and thank you for bringing that up. With all due respect to my friends and colleagues who are architects, I think it takes a suite of design professions to really tackle city structure and city livability. And in my view, there's been a long time prejudice or second-class nature to landscape architects just because of the nature of contracting for big projects, which tend to be building projects. And the landscape architect's role is that they brought in at the end and kind of shrub it up, right? And green up. And in reality, landscape architects are the ones who have the most sensitivity toward the space between buildings and to the larger landscape and the larger fit of buildings within that larger landscape. And so a lot of sympathy for that point of view. And if I have some openings, I'll look for some landscape architects.
Okay.
Thank you. Tom Phipps, retired, I guess you'd say Beasley era senior planner in Vancouver. I'd like to address two things that you raised. One was that intermediate band of density, and the other was the Romans.
It was before the elevator, so the Romans just had that little band of density.
Even when they got to 6 stories in Europe, they still didn't have the elevator.
Yeah, that's true.
A few countries that have 9 and 12 and the elevators don't work. The experience that I had in conversation with people about new higher density living in Vancouver indicated that there's people that like living in higher density areas in Vancouver, but the commonality amongst them appeared to be that they lived in neighborhoods. And what I see happening in the last few years is we've concentrated our opportunities for particularly those intermediate densities on arterials. And my guess is there's a lot of people that don't find the arterial their favorite choice of place to live. So if you're thinking in terms of introducing more of those intermediate variations in density and scale, I think there's a lot of people that would enjoy having the opportunity to still live at that higher density, but in neighborhoods. I think they would also probably like the opportunity to have a say in the nature of those buildings and the shaping of them, as much as we'd like to see more landscape architects involved, more urban design involved. There's no reason that that can't go together with more participation by the people that are going to end up living in them, as they do in co-housing, for an example. And I think the outcomes would be a great deal more diversity. I think it's inevitable that under the time pressures that exist both for staff and for developers, consultants, you end up with things coming out rather the same each time. When you introduce the involvement of people that are going to live there, I think the variation increases. Anyway, that's I think, a good direction to be going. It's a great point. The second thing, involving the Romans, goes back to the 1960s and is kind of adjacent to us at the moment, where you see the north foot of Granville Street, I would say rather decimated by 1960s thinking in urban development. And the Romans would have called that our decumanus in that day. But it ignores the long-term structure of the city, the way it was dealt with. And I wanted to ask if you have had a chance, more than 5 minutes, to think about what kind of process could generate a very desirable public, broad city benefit in the outcomes of redeveloping our central waterfront and address the multi-layered private and public objectives that are needing to merge together there amongst 3 major property owners, 4 levels of government, and a broad public that has a huge interest in the outcomes of the major intersecting points of our city. Anyway, if you've had a chance to give some
You're
thought to the
speaking
nature
of the
of the
sort of
process,
waterfront hub?
central
Yeah.
waterfront area around the foot of Granite Street.
Actually, it was one of the things I remarked on in my address at the Urbanarium, which is I think this is such a huge opportunity. It's such an identity maker for Vancouver, frankly. I mean, get down to the foot of Granville and it's like a multi-story parkade, and like there's supposed to be water there, right? I mean, this is just a huge missed opportunity. On the other hand, even with all the mistakes that have been made, it is just that, it's an opportunity, right? There's nothing there that is sacred that can't be replaced. The rail question, I think, is the one that kind of unlocked a little bit. But we have the power and the design talent in the community here to think that through and give the property owners, the developers there, a different way to think about that opportunity. And so I'm actually really excited about getting engaged in just that. I think it's just a remarkable opportunity. It's like the missing link in the waterfront design of Vancouver.
You seem to have a lot of support for that,
Yeah.
for that one.
I'm bringing you with me to my developer meetings when I meet with those guys.
Okay, over here, and we're coming close to finish, so I'll be looking for one more topic, but then let's.
Thank you. My name is Anthony Norfolk, and I appreciate Tom injecting the hub study and so forth, because yes, I'm one of the working group, several of us here, including Tom and Frank, who are concerned of very specifically the opportunistic approach that at least one property owner in that area is taking, and this becomes a really rather urgent project in the central next big area of the downtown and the waterfront. Yeah. And I'm reassured that you are aware of it. But I think it's becoming desperately urgent to make a move on it.
Yeah, I have that sense. I met for the first time two parties actually together in the same room, which I think is the first time they've ever been in the same room together. Both the key developers there, and basically just said, my role here is to help open up the larger opportunity that's here, which is going to mean some rethinking on your parts about what it is. But that's my part of this conversation, and so I think engaging those of you who've been thinking about this for a long time. I didn't use the words "I'm the new sheriff in town." That's a little bit presumptuous, but I think I sent the message effectively that there has to be a bigger get for the public interest here in that equation. So we'll see.
Okay, one more. Trevor?
This person.
Oh, sorry, your hand's been up for. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm me? Okay, yeah. Tanya Paz, a compliment. Bravo. I've been in the shared economy professionally for about 18 years now, transportation. So great to hear you talk about that and active transportation as a director of planning. A suggestion, open houses could be very different. A certain demographic tends to be able to go and goes a lot. We need to get others there. I was in a basement suite at Kit's library where the windows were sweating. It was a humid day, overcrowded, and anger was going on and on. If we'd added alcohol to that mix, it would have been violent. At the same time, we had one, was it September 15th, Northeast Falls Creek, outdoors, beautiful, right on the spot we were going to be talking about. There was alcohol being served, children playing with Lego, people putting Post-it notes everywhere. It was a beautiful, interactive participation. So we definitely should have it where on the spot we're talking about, or near it. Yeah. Outdoors does tend to calm people down a little. And then my question is, so the city tends to now do neighborhood community plans. Each neighborhood is different. They look at their next 30 years. Some advocate for a master plan of the whole city. Have you received direction from your supervisors on where you'll be going with that?
You know, very fortunate. First of all, I think your first comment's well taken. Serve food, alcohol, have fresh air, and maybe some music. Makes everything a lot better outside if possible. I think that, no, to answer your question very clearly, I have not been given a mandate other than to do good planning from the mayor, the council, or the city manager. In fact, they've actually said they are looking toward me to sort of say, what are the things that we need to focus on, and how should we approach those? And that was frankly a big attraction for me taking the job here, that I had that opportunity to help shape the agenda, and frankly to engage the larger community in shaping that agenda rather than it being sort of already figured out and handed to me to execute. I was not interested in that kind of role, and they've lived up to their promise. So, you know, I probably have 6 months to figure that out, and then they are going to start handing me assignments. Anyway.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're at our
It's a good
at
last
our
question.
time. Very, very, very quick, please.
It's a really good last question. How do you manage expectations? As you know, planning directors have rock star reputations in the city, largely undeserved. If there was a golden era of planning, here was Paxman, the first company was with BC. It's not been the era of planning, it's been the era of the developer. Even that is coming to a close, with the biggest sites in the city being controlled by First Nations and not subject to your policy. So my question to you personally then is, this is a real issue for some of your position. How do you manage expectations by the people in this room and elsewhere so you and the city can succeed?
Yeah, I think part of it is not making promises and then going away and then just letting time go by and letting people criticize. Actually, my philosophy is more about ongoing engagement in that conversation so that I'm painting for you the picture of the challenges that I'm having moving forward in some of these big directions. I don't need to be remembered here as the best urban designer or the best sustainability advocate. There are lots of people who can do that. I need to be, I will be very pleased if I can leave my post here, whenever that is, saying I convened the right conversation and collectively we move the ball forward. That's really how I see my role. Sure, I'd love to be remembered as the best designer on earth. Well, I'm not, I don't even pretend to be that. So it's really about, have I helped this city become much more intentional about addressing these future challenges that I've been, for a decade or more now, I've been working on a book called The Intentional City, drawing initially from my experience in Portland. I think Vancouver shares a lot of that same spirit of a collective will to do better, to do something future-oriented and not just fight about the here and now. And so that's the second reason I'm here, is to, that's my own sort of personal philosophy that I would like to further and to demonstrate here, so how we can collectively be intentional about our future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, we want to thank you by presenting you with some real Vancouver honey made by Vancouver bees, harvested from Vancouver plants, and it's delicious.
Thank you.
And it's created by Hives for Humanity, a social service organization that that does wonderful work in creating honey and sweetness in Vancouver. Thank you. Thank you all. Give yourselves a hand.